The moment Lydia Ford slapped her final bid down on the auctioneer's table and silenced every man in Caldwell, Kansas. She had not yet noticed the cowboy standing at the back of the crowd, with his hat pressed flat against his chest, and his jaw set like he was bracing for a blow he already knew was coming. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas frontier was in the business of turning men into legends and legends into dust, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of both possibilities. The Kishom Trail ran through its veins like a river of cattle and ambition, and every season brought a new wave of men who believed the land itself was waiting for them personally. They came with their pistols and their pride and their bank drafts folded into their breast pockets, and most of them left with considerably less than they arrived with. Lydia Ford was 31 years old, and she was not the kind of woman men noticed when they walked into a room. She was the kind of woman men noticed when they were leaving, when something she had said or done lodged itself in their minds like a splinter they could not quite reach. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and her eyes were the color of the Kansas sky in late September, a gray-blue that could shift to something sharper without warning. She wore her mourning clothes still, though Robert Ford had been in the ground for 8 months, because she had not yet decided what to wear instead. That decision felt larger than it should have, and she was a practical woman who understood that some decisions simply required the proper amount of time. Robert had been a good man in the way that many men of that era were good, which was to say that he had worked hard and meant well and died too young of a fever that swept through the southern counties before anyone had a proper name for it. He had left Lydia with 2 things of value: a modest house at the edge of town and a thorough understanding of land records, because Robert had been obsessed with the parcels and deeds and surveys of the surrounding territory in the way that some men were obsessed with cards or whiskey, and Lydia had sat beside him at the kitchen table for 6 years listening and learning, until the information simply became part of her. What Robert had not left her was money, at least not much of it. There was enough in the bank to last a careful woman through winter, and Lydia was a careful woman, but she had understood since the day of the funeral that careful would not be sufficient. She needed a plan, and the plan had been forming in her mind through the long gray months since October, building itself quietly and steadily, the way a dam builds itself from stones placed one at a time. The plan centered on the Harmon Creek parcel, 60 acres of bottom land running along the southern fork of Harmon Creek, with good water access and soil that had never been properly cultivated, owned by the county since old Amos Harmon had died without heirs 3 years prior. The county had been letting the taxes accumulate and the paperwork drift, but in February of 1878 they announced a public land sale to be held on the first Saturday of May, and Lydia had been ready. She had spent the winter calculating. She had gone to the land records office 4 times and studied the survey maps until she understood the parcel better than the county assessor did. She had spoken quietly with 2 different farmers who had worked neighboring land, and she had walked the boundary of the parcel herself in December, wearing Robert's old boots because hers had not been made for that kind of mud. She had stood on the bank of Harmon Creek in the thin winter light and felt something shift in her chest. Something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something that felt like the first motion of a thing that had been standing still for too long. She had gone to the bank in March and had a conversation with Samuel Pratt, the bank president, that she had rehearsed 6 times in her kitchen the night before. She was a widow with a house free and clear of any mortgage, she explained, and she wished to discuss the possibility of a limited line of credit secured against that property. Samuel Pratt had looked at her over his spectacles with the particular expression that men of his station wore when women came to discuss business, the expression that was not quite condescension and not quite curiosity but somewhere between the two, and he had asked her what she intended to purchase. She had told him. There had been a silence in that office that stretched long enough for the clock on the wall to tick 7 times. Then Samuel Pratt had folded his hands on the desk and said that he was aware of several other interested parties regarding that parcel, and that the bidding was expected to be competitive. Lydia had said that she was aware of that as well. Samuel Pratt had approved a modest line of credit, less than she had hoped for but more than nothing, and Lydia had gone home and continued calculating. The morning of the land sale was clear and cool, with a wind coming out of the northwest that carried the smell of the plains in it. That particular smell of grass and distance that Lydia had grown up with, and that still sometimes made her heart ache for reasons she could not entirely articulate. She dressed carefully in her best dark dress, and she pinned her hair with more precision than usual, and she walked to the courthouse square where the sale was to be held with her reticule held in both hands and her face arranged in an expression of calm that she had also practiced. There were 11 men who had come to bid on the Harmon Creek parcel. Lydia recognized most of them. There was Clarence Webb, who owned the feed store and had been trying to expand his landholdings for years. There was the Dutton brothers, Franklin and George, who ran cattle on the western side of the county and always attended these events together. There was a man she did not know well, a newcomer named Hargrove with a city cut to his suit that suggested money from somewhere east of here. There were ranchers and merchants, and one man who appeared to be representing some interest he was cagey about naming. They all noticed her arrival. She saw them notice it, the slight recalibration that moved through the group, the sideways assessments and the murmured words behind hands. She had expected this. She walked to a position near the front and stood quietly with her reticule and her expression of calm, and waited for the auctioneer to begin. It was at this point, while she was surveying the assembled crowd with the careful attention of someone who had done her arithmetic and was confident in it, that she first properly observed the man standing at the back. He was tall, with the kind of build that comes from years of physical labor rather than anything deliberate, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else. He wore a canvas work coat that had been mended at one elbow, and his hat was a worn brown that had seen weather. He was perhaps 33 or 34 years old, with a face that was angular and weathered and possessed of an honesty that was almost uncomfortable to look at directly, the way a clear sky is sometimes uncomfortable because it hides nothing. He was holding his hat against his chest as if he was in church, and he was looking at the auctioneer's table with an expression that Lydia could only describe, from that distance, as a man watching something beautiful being taken away from him. She looked away. She had work to do. The bidding opened at $40 for the parcel and climbed steadily. The Dutton brothers dropped out at $90. Clarence Webb held on until $120 and then shook his head. The man in the eastern suit pushed it to $150 before he, too, seemed to reconsider. There were 3 men left when the bidding crossed $160, and one of them was Lydia. The auctioneer, a sunburned man named Briggs who had been doing these sales for a decade, had stopped his practiced patter somewhere around $140 and was now conducting the auction with the careful precision of someone who had realized this was going to be unusual. He called the bids clearly and did not allow his expression to reveal anything about the widow bidding against 2 men who very much did not want to be beaten by her. 170. 175, 180. The second man dropped out. It was just Lydia and a cattleman named Burl Stanton who had ridden in from the South County and who had the look of a man who did not lose things as a matter of personal principle. 185. 190. Burl Stanton looked at her. It was a look that was meant to communicate something about the natural order of things. Lydia looked back at him with her September sky eyes and said nothing. 195. Burl Stanton raised his chin and bid $200, which was as round and final a number as he could manage, and he said it loudly and with a certainty that was meant to conclude the matter. Lydia Ford opened her reticule and without any theatricality whatsoever said, $210. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd that has just witnessed something it did not entirely expect. Briggs the auctioneer looked at Burl Stanton. Burl Stanton looked at Lydia. His jaw moved once. Then he shook his head and stepped back, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just had an experience that he will be describing at various dinner tables for the next several years, though he will never quite be able to explain why it affected him as it did. "Sold," said Briggs. "To Mrs. Ford. $210. Lydia exhaled once, very quietly, in a way that no one standing more than 2 feet away would have noticed. Then she turned to approach the table to complete the transaction, and it was in the turning that she saw him again, the man at the back of the crowd. He had not moved. He was still holding his hat. But something in his expression had shifted from what it had been at the beginning, when it had been the expression of a man watching something beautiful being taken away. Now it was something more complicated, and Lydia, who had learned to read people across 6 years of sitting beside her husband while he conducted business in their kitchen, understood in a flash of intuition that this man had come here to bid on this land himself. She stopped. The crowd was already dispersing, men drifting away in 2s and 3s, already constructing the story they would tell about the widow who had outbid everyone at the Harmon Creek sale. Lydia stood holding the deed she had not yet received and looked at the man in the worn brown hat for a moment that lasted only a few seconds but felt considerably longer. He met her eyes. He did not look away. There was nothing in his look that was resentful or angry, which she had half expected. Instead, he looked at her with a directness that was almost startling, as if he had simply decided to be honest about the fact that he had been looking and she had caught him. Then he put his hat on his head, turned, and walked away through the dispersing crowd. Lydia stood there for one more second, holding that look in her mind. Then she went to complete the transaction. She signed the paperwork with Samuel Pratt's bank draft and received the deed, a folded document that was warm from the auctioneer's coat pocket, and she put it carefully in her reticule. Briggs congratulated her on her purchase with the professional courtesy of a man who had long since learned to conduct these things without personal opinion. The crowd had largely gone. Lydia was walking toward the edge of the courthouse square when she found herself beside a woman she knew, a neighbor named Margaret Hale, who was watching her with the particular mixture of admiration and concern that was the standard offering for widows who did things that surprised people. "I saw that young man had a bid sheet," Margaret said without preamble. "Bernard Bristol, he rides for the Colfax Ranch, or he did. I heard Mr. Colfax let him go last month when he sold off the herd." Lydia paused. "Bernard Bristol," she said. "That's right. He came here last fall from somewhere in Texas, they say. Good reputation from what I hear, quiet, works hard." Margaret paused. "He was standing at the back the whole time, didn't bid." "I know," Lydia said. "I noticed." She thought about this for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, while she sat at her kitchen table with the deed laid flat in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold beside it. She thought about it while she reviewed her finances with the honesty that was required by her situation. She had the deed. She had 60 acres of good bottom land along Harmon Creek. She had a plan. But the plan, as she had always understood it, required more than the deed. It required work. It required labor and knowledge and the ability to work ground that had not been touched in 3 years. It required someone who knew cattle and land and the rhythms of this particular stretch of Kansas plains. It required, she acknowledged to herself in the quiet of her kitchen, with the evening light going amber through the window, a partner. The word sat in her mind with a meaning that was strictly practical, and she was careful about that, careful to hold it as the strictly practical thing it was. She thought about the expression on Bernard Bristol's face when he had been looking at the auctioneer's table. She thought about a man who had come to bid on something and had not bid, which meant he had arrived with the intention and lost the courage or the money, and she thought about which of those 2 things it had been. Margaret had said he had been let go from the Colfax Ranch. If he had been dismissed only last month, he would not have had time to accumulate the kind of money needed for the auction. He had come with the intention and had not had the funds. He had stood at the back and held his hat and watched 60 acres that he had perhaps been planning toward for some months walk out of his reach on a clear Saturday morning in May. Lydia looked at the deed. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. But she had also, beneath the practicality, retained something that Robert used to call her streak of the extraordinary, the tendency to occasionally make a decision that was not entirely explainable by the arithmetic but that felt, in some deep and reliable part of her, precisely correct. She made a decision. She found him the next morning. She had asked Margaret for directions, and Margaret had given them with an expression that Lydia declined to interpret, and she had driven her small wagon out to the rooming house on the south end of Caldwell, where 2 or 3 men of the working variety kept rooms between jobs. The morning was cool, and the plains stretched away on either side of the road, with that particular quality of May light that made everything look both very close and impossibly far. Bernard Bristol was sitting on the porch steps of the rooming house with a cup of coffee, wearing his work coat without the hat, and he was looking at the horizon with the steady patience of a man who has learned to live inside his own thoughts without discomfort. He saw her coming and stood up. That was the first thing she noticed about him in close proximity, that he stood up immediately, not as a performance of manners but as a reflex, the automatic courtesy of someone who had been raised to it. He was taller than she had realized from across the courthouse square. His eyes were dark brown and direct. "Mrs. Ford," he said. She stopped the wagon and looked at him. "You know who I am." "Yes, ma'am. You bought the Harmon Creek parcel yesterday. Congratulations on it." There was no sourness in his voice. This struck her as either extraordinary self-possession or genuine generosity of spirit, and she was not yet sure which, so she filed it away. "I did," she said. "I also understand that you came to bid on it and did not." Something moved briefly in his expression. "I came to look," he said. "I didn't have the funds." "How much did you have?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, she could see that, but he answered it without hedging. $40, money I'd saved since coming up from Texas. Lydia nodded once. She reached into her reticule and took out the deed and held it out to him. He stared at it. He looked at her face to see if she was joking or if there was some trick in it that he had not yet identified. There was not. Her expression was calm and entirely serious. "I'd like to discuss a proposition," she said, "but I'm offering this first because I think you ought to hold it while we talk, so you understand the terms before we speak them." Bernard Bristol came down off the porch steps and crossed the short distance to the wagon and took the deed from her hand. He looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was something she had not quite seen on a person before, gratitude and confusion, and a kind of fierce, careful dignity all at once. "What is it you're proposing, Mrs. Ford?" he asked. Lydia had rehearsed this as well. "I bought that land because I've spent the last 6 years learning everything my husband knew about the land in this county, and I knew that parcel was worth considerably more than $210. I also know that I cannot work 60 acres alone, and I do not have the knowledge of cattle and range work that this particular piece of land requires. I need a partner." "A business partner," he said carefully. "That is what I said. I'm proposing a shared arrangement. I provide the deed and the capital, such as it is, which is modest. You provide the labor and the knowledge and the management of the land itself. We divide the proceeds of whatever the land produces, and we revisit the arrangement at the end of the first full season." Bernard was quiet for a moment. He looked at the deed again, then at her. "Why me?" he asked. "You don't know me." "I know you came to bid on that parcel with $40, Lydia said. "A man who saves $40 on a ranch hand's wages and then brings it to a land auction is a man who has a plan for land. I want someone with a plan. I don't want someone who's drifting." He was quiet again. The wind moved through the grass along the road. A crow called from somewhere behind the rooming house. "I'll need to know if your terms are fair before I can agree," he said at last. "They're not perfectly fair," she said honestly. I'm taking the larger risk with the capital. You're taking the larger risk with the labor. At the end of the season, if we both agree the arrangement has been worthwhile, we can discuss a more equal division of the property itself." She paused. "But that's only if the season proves it out." He looked at the deed for a long moment, then held it back out to her. "I'd feel better if you held on to it," he said, "until I've earned some piece of it. It's not right for me to carry the whole deed when I've contributed $40 and nothing else yet." This she had not expected. She took the deed back and put it in her reticule and looked at him with the September sky eyes. "All right," she said. "When do we start?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll be there at first light." She clicked the reins and turned the wagon back toward town. She did not look back, but she was aware, in the particular way that one is sometimes aware of things without seeing them, that he watched the wagon until it was out of sight. He was there at first light. She arrived at the Harmon Creek parcel as the sun was just clearing the eastern horizon and painting the creek bottom in shades of copper and rose, and Bernard Bristol was already there, standing at the edge of the east field with his hat tilted back and a look on his face that was as close to joy as she had yet seen him express, which was to say it was subtle and contained but unmistakably present. "You walked out here?" she asked. "It's not far from town," he said. "I wanted to see it in the morning light." She came and stood beside him. The creek ran quietly behind the cottonwoods at the far end of the field, and the grass was the particular green of early May, and the sky above them was enormous in the way that the Kansas sky always was, as if God had decided to be generous with space if not with much else. "It's good land," he said. "I know," she said. They stood there for a moment in the morning light without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. Then Bernard said, "The soil wants turning along the south field. The north field is drier, better for grazing. The creek bank needs clearing before summer or the spring floods will undercut it." "I noticed the bank in December," she said, "when I walked the property." He glanced at her. "You walked it in December. I needed to know what I was buying." Something settled in his expression, something that was part respect and part recalibration, as if he was adjusting his understanding of a thing. "All right," he said, "then let's get to it." They got to it. The first weeks on the Harmon Creek parcel were the purest and most uncomplicated work that either of them had done in some time. There was so much to do that the doing of it occupied the entire available space of every day, which was, Lydia discovered, one of the things she had needed without knowing she had needed it. Work that fills a day entirely is one of the more effective antidotes to grief, and she had been sitting inside her quiet house for 8 months, letting the grief take up all the room it wanted. Bernard turned the south field with a rented plow, and a horse that he handled with the quiet authority of someone who understood animals from the inside out. He knew how to read the soil with his hands, how to test the moisture and the density and the composition with a handful and a moment of attention. He fixed the creek bank with stones and timber before the first of the big spring rains came, and when the rains came and the creek swelled and pushed against the bank and held, he stood in his coat with the rain running off his hat brim and watched with the satisfaction of a man who has calculated correctly. Lydia managed the financial side of the partnership with the same organized thoroughness she had applied to her research. She kept a ledger. She tracked expenses and projected income with a pencil and a clear eye. She negotiated with the feed store and the hardware merchant and the neighbor who had agreed to lend them a milk cow for the spring in exchange for first rights on hay from the east field. They ate lunch at the property most days, sitting on the low wooden step of the small outbuilding that served as storage and shade, eating whatever Lydia had packed that morning, bread and dried beef, and whatever was available from the early garden she had started behind her house. Bernard ate without ceremony and was always hungry in the straightforward way of someone burning through a great deal of physical energy. He did not make conversation for the sake of conversation, which she appreciated. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. She learned things about him in pieces, the way one learns the layout of a dark room, by moving through it carefully and noting what one encounters. He had grown up in a small town in central Texas, the second of 4 children. His father had been a cattleman of modest means. He had worked ranches since he was 16, moving north through the territories over several years, which was a common enough pattern for young men of his generation who were looking for better wages and better land. He had come to Kansas because he had heard the land was available and the work was honest, and he had spent a year at the Colfax Ranch saving money with the specific intention of bidding on something when the opportunity came. He did not talk much about Texas, and she did not press him. There was something in the way his voice flattened when the subject came up that suggested there was more to the story and that the more was his to keep. She noticed other things. He was careful with everything. He was careful with the tools, careful with the horses, careful with the land itself in the way of someone who understood that land does not forgive careless handling. He was careful with his words. And he was careful, in a way she found both respectful and occasionally frustrating, not to cross any line with her that she had not explicitly drawn. He called her Mrs. Ford, every day without variation. She called him Mr. Bristol. It was the correct form of address and she had no intention of changing it, and yet there was something in the careful maintenance of it, on both sides, that she was sometimes aware of as if it were a physical presence between them. In the 4th week of their arrangement, a situation arose that required them to make a joint decision of some urgency. A man named Cullen Marsh arrived at the Harmon Creek parcel on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 other men, and a manner that was designed to communicate ownership of things. Cullen Marsh was a large landowner from the eastern edge of the county, the kind of man who had arrived in Kansas in the early 1870s with capital and connections, and had steadily expanded his holdings through a combination of legitimate purchase and the sort of pressure tactics that fell just short of being actionable, but were not, in any honest accounting, quite fair. He pulled his horse up at the edge of the south field where Bernard was working and said that he had come to discuss the parcel, and his tone suggested that what he intended to discuss was his acquisition of it. Lydia was at the outbuilding going over the ledger when she heard horses and came out to find the exchange already underway. Marsh had his 2 men flanking him, and he was speaking to Bernard in the measured, patient voice of someone explaining something to a person of limited comprehension. "The parcel was always going to end up in my portfolio," Marsh said. "Mrs. Ford made a fine bid and I respect her initiative, but this is cattle country and this land belongs in cattle operation. I'm prepared to offer her a fair profit over what she paid." Bernard had his hand on the plow and was looking at Marsh with the particular expression of someone who is not going to move and knows it. "That be a question for Mrs. Ford," Bernard said. Marsh turned as Lydia approached, and he arranged his face into something that was meant to be respectful, but had the underlying quality of someone managing a minor inconvenience. "Mrs. Ford, I've just been explaining to your man here. I heard," she said. She stopped at Bernard's shoulder, which was not a position she had planned but which felt natural. "Mr. Marsh, the parcel isn't for sale. Mrs. Ford, I think you should consider." "I have considered," she said. "The answer is no." There was a silence. Marsh looked at her, then he looked at Bernard. Bernard looked back at him without any change in expression. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Marsh said, with a shift in tone that was a shade less pleasant than before. "No," Lydia said calmly. "I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be, which is to say, it's not for sale and that is the end of the discussion." Marsh sat on his horse for another moment, measuring something. Then he turned and rode away with his 2 men, and the 3 of them went across the field and back toward the road without looking back. Bernard watched them go. Then he looked at Lydia, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression came very close to a smile. It did not quite arrive, but the precursor to it was visible. "You've met men like that before," he said. "Every transaction I ever conducted," she said. "They always think that if they're patient enough and polite enough about it, the woman will eventually just agree because it's easier." "And does she?" I've never found it to be the easier option, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the precursor to the smile was fully present now, sitting in the corners of his mouth and the slight ease around his eyes. No, he said, I don't imagine you have. He went back to the plow, and Lydia went back to the ledger, and neither of them mentioned Cullen Marsh again that day, but she was aware of something in the air between them that had shifted slightly, some small increment of ease that had not been there before. The shift continued in the weeks that followed. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that occurs between two people who spend significant amounts of time together doing honest work, a gradual erosion of the careful formality that both parties have been maintaining, not because they were being dishonest about it, but because sustained proximity makes formality eventually unsustainable. She noticed that he began to talk more on the lunch breaks. Not compulsively, not the kind of talking that fills silence because silence is uncomfortable, but real conversation with real content. He asked her once about Robert, quietly, and with the particular care of someone who is not sure they are entitled to ask but is asking anyway. She told him about Robert in the same way, quietly, honestly, without making it larger or smaller than it had been. He listened the way some people listen, with his full attention, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like someone who knew how to pay attention to what mattered." "He did," she said. "He wasn't flashy, but he paid attention." Bernard nodded. "That's rarer than people think." She asked him once about Texas, again carefully, in the same spirit he had asked about Robert. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was before he said something real. Then he said that he had been engaged, years ago, to a girl in his hometown, and that she had married someone else while he was away on a cattle drive. Not because she was faithless, he clarified, but because she had needed someone who would be present, and he had not been present, and in honesty, he had understood it even at the time. "I spent a long time after that believing I was the kind of man who wasn't meant to be somewhere fixed," he said. "I traveled all over, worked every kind of land from Texas to Montana, and I told myself I liked it, the moving." "And now?" she asked. He looked out at the south field where the new growth was already beginning to push up through the turned soil. "Now I think I was just waiting for the right land," he said. And then, after a pause that was just long enough to carry something in it, "and the right reasons." She did not press that. She put it carefully in the part of her mind where she was keeping the things she had not yet decided what to do with. June came, and the south field began to show the early corn they had planted, green rows in the dark soil. And the north field was grazed by 2 cattle that Bernard had purchased at the livestock market, with a combination of his $40 and a small advance from the partnership account. He cared for the cattle with the attentiveness that she had come to expect from everything he did, checking the pasture fence, monitoring the water access, watching for the signs of illness that could move through a small herd without warning. They fell into rhythms. Morning she arrived, they walked the property together, discussed the day's tasks, divided the work. Midday they ate together at the outbuilding step. Afternoon they worked separately, meeting again toward evening to discuss what had been accomplished and what remained. She drove home in the long summer light with dirt on her hands and the particular tiredness that belongs only to useful work, and she cooked supper alone and read by lamplight, and the evenings were quiet but no longer as empty as they had been. There was a moment in early July that she returned to in her mind many times afterward. It had been a hot afternoon, the kind of Kansas summer heat that is not merely temperature but a physical presence, a weight. They had been clearing a section of brush along the fence line, working separately but within sight of each other, and Lydia had been pushing through a particularly stubborn stand of scrub when her foot found a patch of unstable ground at the creek bank, and she went down sideways with a sound that was undignified and sharp. She was not hurt, only startled and somewhat mud-covered and thoroughly embarrassed, and she was already pulling herself upright when Bernard reached her. He was there very quickly, faster than she would have expected from the distance, and he had her by the arm with both hands before she had fully regained her footing. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and the question was asked with an urgency that was completely unguarded, the voice of someone who had not had time to arrange their reaction before speaking. "No," she said. "I'm fine. I'm just—" She looked at her dress, which was considerably the worse for the creek bank encounter. "I'm muddy." He looked at her, and the urgency in his expression did not fully retreat. It shifted into something else, something that sat there for a moment between them while he still had hold of her arm. Both of them stopped in the muddy afternoon heat. "You should be more careful near the bank," he said. His voice had come back to its usual steadiness, but it was a fraction slower than normal. "You told me to be more careful near the bank in May," she said. "I did. I was being careful. The ground moved. Ground does that." He released her arm carefully as if he had only just remembered he was holding it. He stepped back the correct distance. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Bristol." "Lydia," he said, and then stopped, and the words sat in the air between them as if it had surprised both of them equally. It was the first time he had used her name. She became aware of this fact with a clarity that was disproportionate to the smallness of the thing. "I'm sorry," he said. "Mrs. Ford." "No," she said. "It's all right." She bent and retrieved the branch cutter from the mud and went back to work. And he went back to work. And the afternoon continued in its heat and its ordinary industry. But something had shifted again, some further increment of the careful distance between them having been quietly removed. After that day, in her kitchen in the evenings, she sat with her coffee and her book and allowed herself to examine, with the same thorough honesty she applied to the ledger, what she was feeling. She was a practical woman, but she was not a dishonest one. She had not been dishonest with Robert, and she would not be dishonest with herself. What she felt, she acknowledged, was more than the satisfaction of a business partnership proceeding well. It was more than the comfort of having competent company in difficult work. It was the particular attention one pays to a specific person, the way his hands looked when he was working, the way he laughed when something genuinely pleased him, which was rarely but was worth the wait, the way he thought through problems with a quiet deliberateness that she found deeply attractive in the same way she had always found competence attractive, which was to say entirely. She also felt the complicated thing, the guilt that was not quite guilt but was its neighbor, the awareness that Robert had been gone 8 months, and that this feeling, for this specific person, had arrived with a speed that felt both surprising and inevitable. She sat with this feeling honestly and asked herself what Robert would have made of it, and the answer she arrived at, knowing Robert as she had, was that he would have been practical about it in the same way she was trying to be. Robert had loved her and she had loved him, and that was real and it was complete in itself, and it did not require, as a tribute, the remainder of her life spent carefully not feeling anything about anyone. She was 31 years old. The land was growing. The work was honest. The man across the creek bank was the most compelling person she had encountered since she did not know when, and she was alive in a way she had not been since October, and she was going to be honest about that. She also understood that he was being careful, very careful. Careful in the way that she had come to understand was characteristic of him with everything he handled, which was to say he would not rush anything or force anything or take anything that had not been freely and clearly offered. So she decided to be clear. It was a Thursday evening in July, late enough that the heat had broken and the creek bottom was full of the sound of frogs, and the last light was going gold over the cottonwoods. They were finishing the day at the outbuilding, going over the week's accounts, and the conversation had been practical and productive, and now it was drawing to its natural end. Bernard closed the account book and looked at the fading light. "Good week," he said. "Good week," she agreed. There was a moment of comfortable quiet. Then Lydia said, without having planned the exact words, "I want you to know that this arrangement means more to me than a business partnership. What we have built out here, I want you to know I am aware of that." He turned to look at her. The gold light was on both of them. She continued because she had started and there was no dignified way to stop. And I want you to know that when I come out here in the morning, it is not only because of the land. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences she had ever sat inside of. Bernard looked at her with his direct, dark eyes, and she could see something moving through his expression that was large and carefully held and had been held for some time. "Lydia," he said, and this time he said it deliberately. "Yes," she said. "I have been trying to be a man of appropriate conduct," he said. "Because you hired me in a manner of speaking, and because you are a widow who has not been a widow long, and because I did not want to be someone who took advantage of a situation that was fundamentally yours." "That is very honorable of you," she said. "It has also been," he said, "somewhat difficult." She looked at him. "Has it?" "Considerably," he said. The thing that had been sitting in the corners of his mouth since May arrived now completely, and the smile that it resolved into was neither uncertain nor small. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her because it was the full-bodied, unguarded kind, the kind that requires something inside you to be unlocked, and she had not laughed that way in a long time. He heard it and his smile widened, and then he was laughing too, in the low, genuine way he had. And the two of them sat on the outbuilding step in the last July light and laughed together for a long enough moment that the frogs in the creek bed paused in mild confusion before resuming their evening commentary. "Bernard," she said when the laughter had settled. "Yes," he said. "I would like very much if you would ride with me to the church social on Saturday." He looked at her steadily. "As your business partner?" "No," she said. "Not as my business partner." He held her gaze for a moment, and in his expression was the same careful, thorough attention he gave to everything he was serious about. "I would like that very much," he said. Saturday came. He arrived at her house on the horse he had been boarding at the livery stable, wearing a clean shirt and his second hat, which was newer than the first, and sat with a straightness that suggested recent attention. He looked at her when she came out of the house in her green dress, the one she had not worn since the spring before Robert died, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had yet seen from him, simple and complete. "You look lovely," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You look very presentable." He laughed and helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they drove to the church social with the summer evening all around them, and talked the whole way about nothing in particular, about the corn and the cattle, and a story he had from a ranch in Colorado that made her laugh again. And she was aware that this was the easiest she had felt in the company of another person since she did not know when. The church social was held on the grounds behind the First Methodist Church, with tables of food and a fiddle player, and the general sociability of a frontier community that took its rare opportunities for collective pleasure seriously. People noticed them arrive together. She saw the noticing and felt a calm about it that was close to relief. She was done with the careful solitude of widowhood. She was here, and she was with Bernard Bristol, and she felt entirely at peace with both facts. They ate together and talked with the Hale family and with two other couples they both knew slightly. And Bernard was quiet in the social gathering in the way he was quiet everywhere, attentive and easy and unperformed. And she was aware of him beside her with the specific awareness of someone who has decided how they feel about a thing and feels the rightness of the decision in their body. Margaret Hale found her beside the lemonade table and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been proven correct about something. "You look well," Margaret said. "I am well," Lydia said. "He's a good man," Margaret said. "I know," Lydia said. The evening went on. The fiddle player started on something danceable and people moved to make space. Bernard appeared at her side and extended his hand, and it was a question, and she took it as the question it was and took his hand. And they danced on the church lawn in the summer dark with the fireflies starting up in the grass and the stars coming out overhead in the enormous Kansas sky. He was a good dancer. She told him so, and he said that his mother had taught him, and that she had been of the firm opinion that a man who could not dance was a man who lacked a fundamental courtesy. This made Lydia laugh for the third time in a week, which was by some distance a record for the past year. They drove home in the dark, and at her door he helped her down from the wagon and stood for a moment in the warm night with his hat in his hands, and she stood on the step of her house and looked at him. "This was a good evening," he said. "It was," she said. He looked at her with the careful, complete attention. "I want you to know," he said, "that I intend to be straightforward with you about everything. I'm not a man who has a great deal. I have $40 contributed to a partnership and some amount of skill and the determination to make something of this land that we've both put ourselves into. That's what I have." "I know what you have," she said. "I've been watching for 3 months." "I know," he said. "And I know you're a woman who makes her own calculations and arrives at her own conclusions without needing them arrived at for her. But I wanted to say it out loud because I think things said out loud are more honest than things left implied." She looked at him. "Then I will say something out loud as well," she said. "I am not looking for a man who has a great deal. I am looking for a man who is who he says he is, and who will do what he says he will do, and who will be present when being present is required." He held her gaze. "I can be those things," he said. "I have been practicing." "I've noticed," she said. She went inside, and he rode back toward town, and she stood at the window and watched the lantern of his horse lamp moving down the road until it disappeared, and she felt something in her chest that was warm and certain and moving, the way land feels in spring when the winter has finally and completely released it. August was abundant. The corn in the south field was coming in thick and good. The cattle on the north pasture were healthy. The creek bank held against the summer rains, and the Harmon Creek parcel began to look like what Lydia had always believed it could be, which was a working piece of land with a future in it. Bernard and Lydia had fallen into a new rhythm alongside the work rhythm, one that was personal and unannounced and felt, to both of them, as natural as anything they had done. He brought her wildflowers on Tuesdays, not as a performance but because he passed a meadow on the way to the parcel, and the flowers were there, and he was thinking of her. She brought extra bread on Fridays, and they stayed later than necessary on the outbuilding step, talking while the evening came down over the creek bottom. He held her hand when they walked the boundary of the property together in the mornings, which had become a habit that had started without either of them deciding on it, and which neither of them had indicated any wish to discontinue. He called her Lydia now without exception. She called him Bernard. Cullen Marsh came back in August, alone this time, with a revised offer that was somewhat higher and a manner that was somewhat less pleasant than it had been in May. He arrived on a Monday morning when Lydia was alone at the parcel, Bernard having gone to the livestock market, and he made the offer with a tone that was meant to sound like reason, but had an edge in it that she recognized. She told him the same thing she had told him in May, which was that the parcel was not for sale, and she told it to him with the same calm and the same clarity. He pushed a little further than he had before, suggesting that a widow operating a farm with a hired hand was not a sustainable arrangement, and that she would be better served taking a profit while one was available. "Mr. Bristol is not a hired hand," she said. "He is my business partner." Marsh looked at her. "Is that what he is?" "That is what he is," she said. "And the parcel is not for sale. Good day, Mr. Marsh." He rode away, and she watched him go with the same calm she always showed, and then she sat down on the outbuilding step and allowed herself, in private and briefly, to be irritated before she put it away and went back to work. She told Bernard about it that evening. He listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and when she finished he said, "He'll come back." "Probably," she said. "Next time, let me know in advance if you think he's coming," he said. Not protectively, not with any air of managing her, but in the practical tone of someone who has assessed a situation and arrived at a reasonable response. "All right," she said. He did not come back as it happened, at least not in person. But in September, when they had harvested the corn and were calculating the season's accounts with a satisfaction that was very close to pride, They discovered through the county record's office that Marsh had filed a challenge to the deed based on a survey irregularity that he claimed predated the public sale. This was a serious thing. Lydia understood it immediately. She and Bernard sat with the paperwork at her kitchen table, which was the first time he had been inside her house, and she explained what she knew about survey challenges and how they could tie up a deed for months or potentially longer if the county assessor's office was slow or, she said carefully, if someone had influenced the office's pace. "Can it be beaten?" he asked. "Yes," she said. The original survey was completed by a federally licensed surveyor and filed with the Territorial Land Office. Marsh's challenge is based on a secondary county survey that postdates the federal one. Under Kansas land law, the federal filing takes precedence. Do you know this, or do you believe it? Both, she said, but I want an attorney to confirm it. I know a man, he said, Thomas Wickfield in Wichita. He came through Caldwell last spring and I did some work for him while he was visiting the county. He's straight. They wrote to Thomas Wickfield, and Thomas Wickfield came up from Wichita on the Wednesday stage, a small, precise man with wire spectacles and a briefcase that had been around the world at least once by the look of it. He sat at Lydia's kitchen table and examined every document she placed before him with the focused attention of a jeweler examining stones. And at the end of 2 hours he looked up over his spectacles and said, "The federal filing controls. Marsh has no legal ground here and any competent county judge will dismiss the challenge on the survey record alone." "Thank you," Lydia said. "The challenge is likely harassment," Wickfield said, with the mild distaste of a man who has seen this pattern before and finds it tiresome. He is hoping you will find the legal expense and the uncertainty discouraging enough to sell. I would advise you to file a formal response immediately, which I can help you prepare, and to do it quickly enough that it is on the county record before any sympathetic ears in the assessor's office can do anything unhelpful. They filed the response. Thomas Wickfield was proved correct. The challenge was dismissed by the county judge in 2 weeks, and Cullen Marsh, presumably calculating the balance of return against effort, did not pursue the matter further. The land was theirs. It was the word that arrived in Lydia's mind as she sat with the dismissal papers in her hands, theirs, and she turned it over a few times and found it had the solidity and warmth of something that was simply true. October arrived, and with it the full weight of the Kansas autumn, the cold morning gold afternoon quality of it, the smell of the turned earth, the sky that seemed to go higher than it did in any other season. They worked through the harvest with the focused energy of people completing something they had started with intention and were finishing with satisfaction, and the first full season of the Harmon Creek parcel closed with accounts that showed a genuine, if modest, profit. They sat with the ledger in the outbuilding on the last day of October, which was cold enough that they could see their breath, and Bernard looked at the numbers and then looked at her. "You said at the end of the first season we'd discuss a more equal division," he said. "I did," she said. "I'd like to," he said. But he said it in a tone that suggested the division of the land was not the only thing he wanted to discuss, and she looked at him with her September sky eyes and waited. He put the ledger down and looked at her with the complete directness she had come to know as his fundamental mode of honesty. "I have been thinking about how to say what I want to say in a way that is clear and honest, and that is not confused with anything about the land or the business," he said. "I want you to know that what I am about to say has nothing to do with the partnership and is not contingent on the partnership, and would be what I want to say if there were no parcel and no deed and no ledger." She was very still. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since some point in June that I could not give you the precise date of because it did not arrive all at once but rather accumulated until it was simply a fact. And I would like, if you are willing, to ask you to marry me, because I want to be with you in the specific and permanent way that that word describes, and because I have been practicing being present and I intend to continue, and because I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever known." The outbuilding in October was quiet except for the wind off the plains and the distant sound of the creek, and the last light of the afternoon was coming through the high gap in the boards and falling across the space between them. Lydia Ford looked at Bernard Bristol and felt the full and certain warmth of what she felt for him, which she had examined honestly enough in the past months to know was large and real and entirely her own. "Yes," she said. He crossed the small space between them and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at his weathered, honest face with the October light on it, and thought that this was as right as anything she had known, this specific fact of this specific man, and that the land and the work and the long, difficult year had arrived at exactly this. And it was enough, and it was more than enough. He kissed her, and it was unhurried and genuine, the kiss of two people who have been honest with each other about something important and are now, at last, being honest about this. They were married on a Saturday in November, in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, in a ceremony that was small by choice, and attended by Margaret Hale and her husband, Thomas Wickfield, who came up from Wichita because he had developed a fondness for both of them, and a handful of neighbors who had watched the events of the year with varying degrees of understanding and had arrived at appropriate conclusions. Lydia wore a dress that was not black, the first she had worn in over a year, a deep blue, the color of the sky she had always loved in October. Bernard wore a suit that had been purchased in Wichita by mail order and had arrived the week before and fit him well enough that Margaret Hale declared it a success. He stood at the altar with a stillness that was not nervous but collected, the way he stood at the edge of the land in the morning, present and certain. When she came down the aisle on the arm of a neighbor who had agreed to stand with her, Bernard looked at her the way he had looked at the land in May, as if it was something worth whatever you had to do to keep it. She looked back at him, and everything she felt was in her face. She made no effort to conceal it, because she had come to believe that concealment was the waste of something that was meant to be seen. The ceremony was simple and quick, which was the style of the time and the place, and the minister was a practical man who said the words with dignity and brevity, and Lydia and Bernard made their promises in the clear November air of the church with the voices of people who were used to meaning what they said. After the ceremony, the small group gathered at Lydia's house, which was Lydia and Bernard's house now, for a supper that Margaret Hale had organized with her characteristic competence, and there was food and conversation and something that was close to gaiety, the particular joy of people who have come through difficult things and arrived at something good. Thomas Wickfield proved to have unexpected gifts as a storyteller, and Bernard, over a glass of the good whiskey the lawyer had brought, laughed with the full-bodied, unself-conscious laugh that Lydia had first heard from him on the outbuilding step in July, and she sat across the table and watched him laugh, and felt the warmth of it in her chest with the clean certainty of something that was going to be permanent. Winter settled over Harmon Creek and Caldwell with the usual Kansas deliberateness. They worked through it together, the maintenance of the winter land requiring a different kind of attention than the summer, quieter and more internal, the work of fences and feeding and planning for spring. The house was warmer with two people in it, which was both the literal truth and the other kind. In the evenings Bernard read, which she had not expected from him but which delighted her, because he read with the same thorough attention he gave to everything. She read alongside him, and they talked about what they were reading with the ease of two people who have no need to perform for each other. He made coffee in the mornings with a precision that she teased him about, and that he defended on the grounds that coffee made incorrectly was an ethical failure, which was the funniest thing she had ever heard him say, and which she repeated to Margaret Hale, who agreed it was characteristic. In February, Lydia told him she was expecting. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where they told each other important things, because the kitchen table was where everything real in a house happens. He looked at her across the table with the unguarded expression that she had come to understand was his face when he was receiving something too large to process in the usual way, and then he said, quietly and with everything in it, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and the morning light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and everything that needed to be said was in that silence. "This land is going to have more reasons in it," he said at last, which was one of the most Bernard things he had ever said, oblique and honest and exactly right. Spring came again to Harmon Creek, and the land came alive in the same way it had the year before, but with an added quality to it, the quality of something being continued rather than begun. Bernard worked the south field again with the same careful attention, and the north field had 3 cattle now instead of 2, and the creek bank held with the stones and timber he had reinforced it with the previous summer. He was attentive to Lydia through her pregnancy in the practical, undemonstrative way that was his manner with everything he cared about, which was to say constant and solid, and without ceremony but entirely dependable. She continued to manage the ledger and the business decisions and the correspondence through her pregnancy with the same focused energy as always, because she was not someone who was well served by being coddled, and he understood this and had never attempted it. He did, quietly, take over the heavier fence work without being asked, and he was always at the house in the evenings no later than he needed to be, and he woke in the night sometimes when she did and lay awake with her in the way of someone who could not sleep while she was awake, which she told him was unnecessary, and which she privately found deeply comforting. Their son was born in October of 1879, on a morning when the frost was on the Harmon Creek grass, and the sky was the particular blue of deep autumn. It was a hard labor, which frightened Bernard in a way that he had not been frightened since he was young, the particular fear that has no action attached to it, that simply requires endurance. He sat in the front room while the midwife worked, and he was very still in the way that he was still when something mattered most, the way he stood at the edge of the field in the morning looking at something he was trying to understand completely. When the midwife came and told him that Lydia was well and the child was well and he could come, he crossed the house in 4 steps and sat beside the bed and looked at his wife holding a small, red-faced, entirely alert child, and the expression on his face was the most open she had ever seen it, completely without defenses, simply feeling what was true. "He looks angry," Bernard said, which was both accurate and funny, and Lydia laughed from the bed and said that he looked just like his father when he was thinking about a problem. "I don't look angry when I think," Bernard said. "You look extremely focused," she said diplomatically. They named him Robert James Bristol, after Robert Ford and after Bernard's father, because Lydia had suggested it and Bernard had looked at her over the baby's head with an expression that was gratitude and love in equal measure, and he had said that was exactly right. Robert James Bristol grew in the way that children on working land grow, which is to say sturdy and curious, and with an early understanding of the rhythms of earth and weather. He was walking before his first birthday and into everything by summer, with a determination that his parents recognized from both directions of his inheritance. The second year of the Harmon Creek parcel was better than the first, which is what a well-managed piece of land does when you give it consistent attention and honest work. The south field produced a larger corn harvest. They added a 4th and 5th cow to the north pasture. Bernard had developed a reputation in the county as someone who understood cattle management, and 2 neighboring ranchers came to him over the winter of 1879 and 1880 with questions about their herds, which he answered with the straight talk that was his nature, and which resulted in an informal consulting arrangement that added a meaningful income stream to their accounts. Lydia, with more confidence now in the stability of their situation, began to think about the expansion she had always believed the parcel was capable of. There was 20 additional acres adjacent to the south field that had come available following the death of its elderly owner, and the price was reasonable. She presented the plan to Bernard at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the arithmetic laid out, and he listened and asked the right questions and added 3 considerations she had not thought of. And by the end of the evening, they had a revised plan that was better than either of them had arrived with. They purchased the additional 20 acres in the spring of 1880. The 80 acres of Harmon Creek was beginning to be something that people in the county referred to as an example of what good management could do, and the fact that the management was conducted by a former widow and a cowboy who had come in with $40 was a story that people told with varying degrees of editorial content depending on who was telling it. Some told it with admiration. Some told it with the slightly uncomfortable respect of people who expected something different and are trying to be honest about having been wrong. And some, not many, told it with the generosity of people who simply believe that good things happening to good people are a straightforward kind of justice. Cullen Marsh had sold off some of his eastern holdings and moved to Wichita, and the stories that followed him, there were not ones that reflected well on his methods, which Lydia noted in the ledger of her mind under the heading of things that confirm the wisdom of holding firm. The land reform and the settlement of the frontier had brought other changes to the county that were harder to watch with equanimity. The Kaw people, whose territory this had all been, were being pushed further and further into diminished corners by the same land policies that had allowed Lydia to purchase her parcel at auction. She was aware of this injustice in the way that the most honest settlers of that era were aware of it, with the uneasy knowledge that the system she had benefited from was built on a foundation that had not been built fairly. She could not undo this, but she could be honest about it, and she was. Bernard had said, once, sitting on the outbuilding step with the evening coming down, "My grandfather told me that the people who were here first knew this land in a way that took generations to learn, and that we are learning it much more slowly and clumsily, and have been given no credit for how much we owe them for every piece of knowledge about how this ground works." Lydia had looked at him and thought that this was one of the things she loved about him most, his capacity for honesty that extended past the comfortable edges of what honesty required. "We can at least do the land the justice of understanding it properly," she said. "That much we can do," he agreed. By the autumn of 1881, the Harmon Creek property was what Lydia had envisioned from the beginning, a working farm with a sustainable income, a house that had been expanded to accommodate a family that had grown in ways she had not imagined when she was walking the boundary alone in December of 1877. The outbuilding had become a proper barn. There was a new fence line running the full perimeter of the property. The corn south field was the best producing land in the southern county, which was a fact that Bernard received with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has given their best effort to a thing and watched it produce honestly. Robert was 2 years old and luminously energetic, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's capacity for focused attention, and he had already demonstrated a fierce interest in every animal on the property that suggested his occupational future was reasonably clear. Lydia was expecting their second child, which she had told Bernard in the same way as the first, at the kitchen table in the morning light, and he had responded in the same way as before, with the complete attention and the extended hand and the quiet, "Are you well?" That was his particular language for what he felt. She was very well. They had come, by the winter of 1881, to a life that was full in the way that working lives are full, the fullness that comes from having things that matter and being capable of managing them. They worked hard and the work was honest. They disagreed sometimes, in the direct, respectful way of people who have never been dishonest with each other and have no intention of starting. Bernard was occasionally too stubborn about his own physical limitations, which Lydia managed by presenting him with the relevant arithmetic about the cost of working injured, which was the only language he consistently responded to on this subject. Lydia was occasionally too willing to take on more than was comfortable because comfort had never been a value she prioritized highly enough. And Bernard managed this by taking things off her plate so quietly that she often did not notice until the thing was already done, which was the kind of management she could accept because it did not diminish her, but only added to what was available. Their daughter, Clara Mee Bristol, arrived in the spring of 1882 with less drama than her brother and considerably more opinions about her immediate environment, which she communicated with clarity and without hesitation. Bernard held her in the morning light of the day after her birth, in the kitchen with the sunrise coming through the window, and the look on his face was the same as it had been with Robert, that completely open love that arrived before any other thought could arrange itself. "She already seems like someone who knows what she wants," he said. "Good," Lydia said from the doorway. "She'll need it." Robert, having been brought in to observe his sister with the gravity that 2-year-olds bring to significant events, touched her forehead with one careful finger and said, "Small," with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has examined a thing and found it to be exactly as described. The spring of 1882 was the spring that Lydia would think of in later years, as the season the land became truly theirs, not in the legal sense, because the deed had always been clear, but in the deeper sense of a place that knows you and that you know in return, that carries the specific quality of your specific attention in its soil and its fences, and the way the water moves through it. 5 years of consistent, intelligent work had given the Harmon Creek parcel a character, and the character was unmistakably theirs. Bernard stood at the edge of the south field one morning in May in the corn-planting time, and Lydia came and stood beside him the way she had on the first morning, and they looked at what 60, now 80 acres of Kansas bottom land had become under their hands. "Do you remember the first morning?" she asked. "I came early," he said. "You did. I thought you might not come at all." He looked at her. "I had nowhere else I wanted to be," he said. Which was both a practical answer and, coming from Bernard Bristol, everything else as well. She took his hand. The corn was planted. The cattle moved slowly on the north pasture in the morning light. From the direction of the house, they could hear Robert shouting something about a dog, which suggested the ongoing saga of his attempt to convince his parents that the farm required a dog was entering a new phase. "He's going to win eventually," Bernard said. "He knows it," Lydia said. "He's just giving us the opportunity to arrive at the conclusion ourselves. That's very patient of him. He gets it from his father," she said. Bernard looked at her with the warm, full, undefended look that she had received for 4 years now, and that had never become ordinary. That remained, every time, exactly what it was. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the conversation we had in October of 1878. "Which part of it?" she asked. "The part where I told you what I had, which was $40 and some skill and the intention to make something of the land. I want to revisit that accounting." She waited. The morning was full of the sounds of a working farm and the plains beyond it. "I have more than that now," he said. "I have this land and this work and a man I can look at in the mirror without embarrassment. I have a son who talks to cattle as if they have opinions, and a daughter who already knows how to make people pay attention. I have a partnership that is the most honest thing I have been part of in my life." He paused. "And I have you, which is the thing I did not know to put on any accounting until you handed me a deed on a porch step and asked me to work with you on something." Lydia felt the warmth in her chest that was Bernard's particular gift to her, the specific warmth of being known completely and cared for because of it rather than in spite of it. "That is a considerably more complete accounting," she said. "I am a more complete man than I was in 1878, he said. "You were already a complete man in 1878, she said. "You had the essential parts." He looked at her with the smile that had been arriving at the outbuilding step in the gold July light of their first summer. "So did you," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and they stood together in the May morning at the edge of their south field, the two of them, as they had stood together at the edge of everything they had built, with the work ahead of them and the work behind them and the enormous Kansas sky overhead. And the land at their feet was warm with the season and full of everything they had planted in it, which was considerable, and which was growing. Robert appeared at the edge of the field with the purposeful stride of a small person on an important mission and announced that there was a dog at the barn. Bernard and Lydia looked at each other. "A stray?" Bernard asked his son. Robert considered this. "He looked hungry," he said. "I gave him some bread." "You gave him some bread," Bernard said. "He was hungry," Robert said, with the simple logic of someone who does not understand what is complicated about this. Bernard looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Bernard. The morning was bright and the land was full and their children were safe, and the accounts were sound, and the work was honest, and everything that they had built together was standing in the May light as solid as the creek bank that had been reinforced the first spring, and had not moved since. "I suppose we have a dog," Bernard said. Lydia laughed, the full-bodied, unguarded laugh that had been a gift he had given her back to herself, the laugh that required something inside to be unlocked, and she laughed it freely in the morning light of the Harmon Creek parcel in the spring of 1882, with her husband beside her and her children ahead of her and the land beneath her feet. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. The dog's name, as determined by Robert with the unilateral decisiveness of someone who is 3 years old and therefore entitled to name things, was Cap, short for Captain, because Robert had heard someone use that word and found it satisfactory. Cap was a cattle dog of uncertain parentage and considerable intelligence, and he took to the Harmon Creek operation with the same focused competence that characterized its other residents, and the North Pasture cattle were, by all observable measures, improved by his management of them. Clara grew and walked and talked in the way of children who are determined to keep up, watching her brother's example, and then surpassing it in certain areas, including an early and complete mastery of the kitchen that she attributed to watching her mother, and that Lydia recognized as the same combination of observation and determination that had informed every decision she had ever made that mattered. The seasons continued in the honest rhythm of working land, each one building on the previous, each one carrying the weight of what had been planted and the light of what was possible. Bernard expanded the herd carefully and managed it with the skill that had made his reputation, and his consulting work in the county had grown into a recognized practice that 2 or 3 young ranchers sought out specifically, and which he conducted with the same direct honesty he brought to everything. Lydia kept the ledger and managed the books with an eye that had only sharpened over the years, and the Harmon Creek accounts were the clearest example she knew of what happened when arithmetic was applied with both accuracy and courage. They walked the boundary of their 80 acres on Saturday mornings, the two of them, as they had been doing since the first spring, through the seasons and the years, a habit that had become the particular kind of sacred that working people make from the things they choose to repeat because the things themselves matter. Bernard checked the fence line and the creek bank, and the state of the fields with the attention of someone who knows that land requires constant, present care, and Lydia walked beside him with the same attention, noting the things she noted in the ledger of her mind that was always open. They did not have a perfect life, because no one has a perfect life, and the frontier in the late 1870s and early 1880s was not a place that offered perfection as an option. There were hard winters and difficult harvests, and the ordinary human frictions of 2 strong-minded people sharing a house and a dream. There were illnesses and injuries that required fear to be endured quietly and care to be given steadily. There were business decisions that did not work out as planned, a crop failure one summer from a drought that struck the southern county hard, a year when the cattle prices fell, and the arithmetic required significant recalculation. They moved through these things with the same qualities they brought to everything, The honesty, the attention, the willingness to say the difficult thing clearly rather than avoid it until it grew larger. They had arguments, genuine ones, where both of them were wrong in different ways and had to find their way back to each other through the wrongness, which they always did, because they had both decided that this was the life and this was the person, and the deciding was complete. On an evening in the autumn of 1883, when Robert was 4 and Clara was 1.5 and the Harmon Creek farm was entering its 6th year, and the accounts showed a stability that had been earned through every hour of every season, Lydia and Bernard sat on the step of the outbuilding as they had done from the beginning, now properly a barn, but with a step they had never replaced because the original step was part of how they had started. And they watched the last light go over the cottonwoods at the creek. "I want to ask you something," Bernard said. "All right," she said. "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him, and the question was his, completely the careful honesty of a man who wanted to know the real answer and not a polite version of it. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, which was her way with things that deserved seriousness. "I am," she said, "completely, in the way that is not about everything being easy but about everything mattering. Yes, I am happy." He nodded once, receiving this as he received everything real, fully and without deflection. "I am too," he said. They sat in the autumn evening with the land all around them, and the creek moving quietly behind the trees, and the large, generous Kansas sky filling with the first stars of the evening. And the happiness they were sitting inside was the real kind. The kind built from the work of two people who had chosen each other, and their life, and their land with intention and honesty, and had tended all three with the same careful, constant attention. Somewhere behind them in the house, Clara shouted something imperious at Robert, who responded with the patience of an older sibling who has learned that the shouting is usually about something real. Cap barked once and then fell silent. The cattle moved in the north pasture. Bernard and Lydia sat on the step of the old outbuilding in the autumn evening, and the story of the Harmon Creek parcel and the two people who had built their life on it was, in all the ways that mattered, entirely and beautifully complete.